Hello, it's Sharon Schlurf Newcomb with my comfort cat here, Otis, who's actually laying on the papers that have my notes for what I was going to say today, but I will manage anyway. We really don't like to disturb Otis once he gets settled in, so we'll see what he does next. In any case, today we're going to have an interesting subject. I've got a series of titles and subject matters that I want to be able to do with you that are particularly pertinent to wellness and resiliency and some of the things that we do here at the Warrior Way Wellness Center in Williamsburg, Virginia. And we actually provide peer workforce training and peer support services, and I'll explain what those are in a minute. But one of the reasons we do what we do in behavioral health in this paraprofessional career that we train many people to be able to do for a living and helping others with wellness and resiliency includes law enforcement and also our civilians, and especially many people who have been impacted negatively and traumatically even by COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the very first things I'm just going to talk about today is what a lot of people call post-traumatic stress disorder. If you're familiar with that term, post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health diagnosis that happened many years ago, actually decades ago, when long after our Vietnam veterans and even Desert Storm had come back from deployments. And post-traumatic stress disorder is the natural reaction to unnatural events. That's post-traumatic stress, but it became a mental health diagnosis years ago because the way the person exhibits the stress is usually behavior, and it's different types of stressors and triggers, and the behaviors can be multiple or singly apart. There are things that it's the depression, there's anxiety, there are just sometimes people are erratic in their behavior or their decision making or cognitively not thinking clearly. And what's been determined is that's why it's become a mental health, behavioral health diagnosis called post-traumatic stress or PTSD. The challenge is, why is it called PTSD when in fact, and more recent evidence in science and what we provide the support and wellness and healing for is actually called post-traumatic stress injury. And so I'm going to give you some factors on initially what has been said even in a military review article, and why some changes for the military were presented to change the diagnosis of PTSD to post-traumatic stress injury for these reasons. And here's the military review article that was published in April of 2013. An injury, not a disorder. Dr. Frank Ochberg, who I actually had the pleasure to meet at a conference, have lunch, discuss the matter, and get more information, and have followed him ever since then on the evidence and the reports that have been published with his name and others on them so that I could be very well versed. And here's June. Hello, June. June does not have post-traumatic stress disorder or even an injury. June is a very cool cat. And this is Otis's wife, June. Okay, she didn't like that. So in any case, I actually touched her tail. I'm so sorry. Now it's a trauma. All right, so Dr. Ochberg, I have followed the research and the science all these years, and so here's what he provided in this military review article. He details post-traumatic stress disorder has been an accepted diagnosis since 1980. Told you it was decades. But some clinicians with a wide range of veterans advocates, women's groups, and others are advocating for a name of the diagnosis PTSD to PTSI for post-traumatic stress injury. Why? In large part, General Peter Torelli, retired Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, has inspired this argument himself. After 2 tours in Iraq, General Torelli grew alarmed by rising suicide rates in the Army. He reviewed every case and concluded that many service members and women hate the term disorder and suffer in silence rather than seeking help. For a soldier who sees the kinds of things soldiers see and experience on the battlefield today, to tell them what they're experiencing is a disorder does a tremendous disservice, he said. It's not a disorder, it's an injury. And that statement comes from Jonathan Shea, MD, PhD, whose pioneering studies of veterans earned him a MacArthur Fellowship. And Dr. Ochberg also agreed. Dr. Ochberg was originally with the National Institute of Health back in 1980 when the original PTSD was determined. Dr. Ochberg now agrees with General Torelli as well. And he wrote to the president of the American Psychiatric Association on April the 7th of 2012, which is just about the time I met him, proposing that the new edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, currently under review, adopt the PTSI name. Now, if you're familiar with the DSM manual, it's actually a diagnostic tool that represents mental health, different diagnoses and the descriptions of them and how they affect people, and that is when that is determined. And there was a new one due out. They don't do them that very often, but things do change. And so they were trying to change it at that time in 2012. Dr. Ochberg and the others wrote that there was a crisis of suicide, stigma, and misunderstanding affecting young veterans, as well as the name PTSD affects civilian survivors of trauma as well. Crime victims, women who are raped and battered, and others who develop the syndrome. They also explain how the injury model applies to the history, theory, and treatment of this condition, usually by medication. So now let's talk a little bit about the Global PTSI, Post-Traumatic Stress Injury Foundation, Healing Heroes. We'll put the web link for them for all of you below the podcast. Why is it really post-traumatic stress injury? PTSI is an acronym for post-traumatic stress injury, replacing the more common acronym PTSD for post-traumatic stress disorder. Although both terms are used, we feel that the word injury is a better descriptor than the term disorder. Thus, the decision to incorporate it into the foundation's name, and again, being considered for the diagnostic manual DSM previously. Post-traumatic stress is a biological injury that develops after a person has experienced or witnessed a terrifying event. Many medical professionals believe it's a biological trauma which has a biological treatment, including the stellate ganglia block. Through the Healing Hero Fund, our organization provides access to SGB. That would be the Global Foundation. Learn more about how they work. Again, we'll have that link. Let me explain that here, and especially with all of this relationship with the Global Foundation and with Dr. Ochberg and these others, and particularly being military care providers, that I have been advocating for the difference since 2012 and have actually followed the science of all of the brain scans that are now available, the equipment has now been showing that similar to traumatic brain injury, which would be from an impact or a concussion or so many other things within the brain causing inflammation, that in fact traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress injury look alike on a brain scan called an fMRI. That's the brain scan that's used. So the fMRI allows this brain scan to show hot spots in the brain. And a lot of those hot spots are due to when there's a trigger, in other words, a memory, a flashback, a noise, a smell, anything within the five senses, that trigger for someone who is struggling with trauma. What will happen is there's adrenaline that floods the brain, and that adrenaline is important because that's your survival mode. However, continued adrenaline, too much adrenaline, will begin to damage or inflame certain spots of the brain. Again, very similar look to traumatic brain injury. So it can be confusing on whether or not it's PTSI or PTS. Disorder would not be a disorder. It's not a disorder unless your life is unmanageable. That's what I've already said, because I was diagnosed with PTS back in 2001 when I was seriously injured, impacted, responding to an accident and snowstorm scene, and I was struck by a vehicle. And at that same injury and accident, I also hit my head and my back and suffered traumatic brain injury as well. So when I actually went to a neurologist several months later and I was examined and went through scans, it was the neurologist in 2001 who said, you have post-traumatic stress, but you don't have the disorder because you're managing. And one of the reasons I managed was because of my background and my training and my disaster training. So I was coping in a different way with the challenges I was facing physically and disabled and pain. I was managing things differently, so life was not in disorder for me. And I hope that helps some of you out there. But at the same time, that's when I was really excited years later, because even the label of PTS was severe enough, in my opinion, along with everything else that had gone wrong. But when I understood more, and particularly in my own traumatic brain injury, understanding from Dr. Ochberg and others that the ways of coping and wellness in dealing with all of the things that I would have to do for the long-term future for my ability to function anywhere nearly as close and stability and a healthy, good life and being able to work or do a mission, those things were what was important to me, that I learned and knew more about wellness and resiliency and how to cope than most people would. So if we're looking at coping, we're coping with the behavior. We're coping with the challenges of an injury, just like we would be if we had arthritis or if we're in this pandemic. All the things that we need to do to cope with our mind, our emotions. Our right brain is emotions, our left brain is logic, and then our core belief systems. What we're teaching is coping skills so that people can deal with an injury and use holistic healing when it comes to nutrition, vitamins, and yes, sometimes pharmaceutical medications are necessary. I don't have issues with that, but what we like to look forward to more is how to help people for the long term. So further information, because I mentioned other treatments like the stellate ganglia block, which is many people are achieving access to those through their doctors. Not all, or as far as I know right now, the stellate ganglia block is being studied by the VA for treatment, but I'm not sure that they have actually approved it yet, but doctors' offices and other places are using that. There's also hyperbaric oxygen treatment. There are other natural ways that we're looking at in terms of just the supplements and essential oils. I'm not saying they necessarily heal the brain or heal the trauma, but a lot of these other things help the coping mechanisms that people can have in order not to have the additional adrenaline and cortisol and chemicals going through your body based on natural responses to unnatural triggers. Overall, just a heads up, of the stellate ganglia block treatments, 120 of them were provided to date, with 95% of the funds raised going directly to treatment, with 5% allocated for overhead. And I'm talking about, this is the report from the Global PTSI Foundation. With over 1.3 million diagnosed U.S. veterans, and this is a couple of years ago, with 95% of funds raised, and with 1.3 million diagnosed U.S. veterans, and a global epidemic of veterans and civilians suffering from PTSD or PTSI, please help them and please help us promote and provide the best methods of treatment to achieve a marked impact. We want to save lives. Post-traumatic stress injury and traumatic brain injury are the greatest suicide cause. They are the greatest cause for suicide, which is also why we've developed this new program, pilot program, that is called Reveille One More Day. And our Reveille One More Day program is all about those who have either had a suicide ideation or failed attempts at suicide, or lost a loved one or friend to suicide, or a battle buddy, that our team here actually understands. And I already put, that's one of my very first posts, I already gave an honest exposure and story of myself for my own suicide ideation. So now what I'm telling you is, this lady sitting right here in this desk with this very lazy cat has had all of this. I'm sharing my journey with all of you. And I'm saying I've been there. I'm part of the club that has managed to survive 21 years now based on these really serious challenges. And my life is really pretty good order. So please help us with Reveille One More Day in assisting with these wellness and resiliency and preventing any further harm by helping people heal, by giving them the coping skills and the places where they can get the resources that they need wherever they are, and also being able to support the change. I've made a pledge to eventually change post-traumatic stress disorder to post-traumatic stress injury, because that's the truth.